In 1839, the world's most powerful empire went to war. They didn't fight for land. They didn't fight for gold. They fought for the right to sell illegal drugs to millions of people. Why? Because they were addicted to a leaf. That leaf was tea. And the story of how it conquered the world is much darker than you think. We think of tea as a calming drink. It is the drink of grandmothers. It is for quiet afternoons and rainy days. But history tells a different story. Tea was once the most dangerous commodity on earth. It caused the fall of dynasties. It sparked the American Revolution. It fueled the African slave trade. And it created the world's first corporate drug cartel. But here is what historians often skip. For thousands of years, the West didn't even know tea existed. Europeans were drinking dirty water and weak beer. Meanwhile, the East had unlocked the secret to health and focus. When these two worlds finally collided, it wasn't peaceful. It was catastrophic. How did a bitter plant from the mountains of China take over the globe? And how did the British steal the secret of its production? Yes, they stole it. The cup of tea on your desk is the result of the greatest industrial heist in history. To understand this war, we must go back. We need to look at the world before tea was global. Picture the year 1600. The Ming Dynasty rules China. They are the superpower of the world. Their economy is sophisticated. Their art is unmatched. And their diet includes a drink that keeps them healthy. They call it cha. Now, look at Europe in the same year. It is dirty. It is plagued by disease. Water is often unsafe to drink. So, people drink alcohol. Morning, noon, and night. Beer and cider are the safe options. This means much of Europe is walking around slightly drunk. All day long, productivity is low. Life expectancy is short. But in China, they boil their water. They add tea leaves. This kills bacteria. The tea provides caffeine. It gives focus without the crash of alcohol. This simple habit gave the East a massive advantage. But for the Chinese emperors, tea was more than a drink. It was a state secret. It was a monopoly. Foreigners could buy the leaves, but they could never, ever see how it was made. Exporting the live plants was a crime punishable by death. The stakes were absolute. Enter the Dutch. They were the FedEx of the 17th century. Their ships sailed everywhere. In 1610, they brought the first shipment of green tea to Europe. It was strange. It was bitter. And it was incredibly expensive. 1 pound of tea cost the equivalent of a year's wages for a laborer. It was a status symbol. If you had tea, you had power. But there was a problem. Europeans didn't know how to make it. Some boiled the leaves, threw the water away, and ate the bitter leaves on buttered toast. It was a disaster. It seemed like a fad that would die out. But then, addiction set in. The caffeine hit was unlike anything they had known. Writers could write longer. Scientists could think clearer. The Enlightenment itself was fueled by caffeine. But here is the catch. China was the only supplier. The entire world's supply came from one country. This created a dangerous economic imbalance. Europe needed tea, but China didn't need anything Europe had. China wanted silver, only silver. So European nations began draining their treasuries. They shipped tons of silver to Canton. It was a hemorrhage of wealth. The British Empire looked at their bank accounts. They were terrified. They were running out of money. They needed a way to get tea without paying for it, or they needed to force China to trade. What happened next would stain the soul of the British Empire forever. But before we get to the war, we must discover where this plant actually came from. The origin story is not what you expect. Let's rewind 5,000 years. The year is 2737 BC. The legendary Emperor Shennong is sitting under a tree. He is boiling water. A wind blows. Leaves drift down from a wild tea bush. They land in his pot. The water turns gold. He drinks it. He feels revitalized. This is the legend. It is a beautiful story, but the reality is much stranger. Early tea wasn't a beverage. It was food. It was medicine. Tribes in southwest China chewed the raw leaves for energy. Later, they steamed the leaves. They pounded them into a paste. They mixed this paste with other ingredients. Imagine a soup made of tea, onions, ginger, and orange peel. Sometimes they added animal fat. It was savory. It was thick. It was nothing like your Earl Grey. For centuries, this was the norm. Then came the Tang dynasty. This was the golden age of tea. A man named Lu Yu wrote a book. It was called The Classic of Tea. It was the first definitive guide on tea culture. Lu Yu hated the soup method. He called it swill from a ditch. He advocated for purity, just water, just leaves, a pinch of salt. He elevated tea to an art form. But here is a detail most people miss. During this time, tea was money, literally. The Chinese compressed tea into hard bricks. These were called tea bricks. They were stamped with a seal of value. You could travel the Silk Road and pay with tea. In Siberia, these bricks were currency until World War II. That is not a typo. Tea bought horses. Tea bought land. If you had tea bricks, you were rich. But the real story gets stranger. By the time Europeans arrived, China had changed its methods again. The Ming Emperor banned tea bricks. He wanted loose-leaf tea. This decision changed history. Loose-leaf tea spoils faster. It is harder to transport. If the Europeans had arrived 200 years earlier, they would have shipped bricks. Instead, they had to build the fastest ships in the world. They built the tea clippers, all because an emperor changed his mind. But as tea moved west, it was about to cause a royal scandal. It started with a wedding. The year was 1662. Catherine of Braganza arrived in England. She was a Portuguese princess. She was marrying King Charles II. Her luggage was heavy. It wasn't filled with gold. It was filled with dried leaves. The English court was confused. They were drinking ale. Catherine asked for a cup of tea. The courtiers scrambled. They had none. They offered her beer. She was horrified. Catherine stuck to her tea. She was the queen. So, the ladies of the court copied her. Suddenly, tea was fashionable. It moved from the palace to the wealthy mansions. It was a feminine drink. It was served in delicate porcelain. It was a symbol of sophistication. But the men were not left out. They took tea to a different place, the coffee house. Wait, why were they drinking tea in a coffee house? Because coffee houses were the internet of the 1600s. They were penny universities. You paid a penny for admission. You got news, gossip, and caffeine. But coffee was rough. Tea was exotic. Soon, the East India Company began importing more tea than coffee. By 1750, tea was the national drink of Great Britain. The transformation was complete. But there was a catch. The government saw a gold mine. They slapped taxes on tea. Huge taxes, over 100%. This made legal tea unaffordable for the poor. But the poor were already addicted. So, what happened? Crime. Massive, organized crime. Smuggling gangs took over the coast of England. They were brutal. They were not lovable rogues. They murdered customs officers. They fought pitched battles with the army. At one point, more illegal tea was drunk in England than legal tea. But the smugglers were also scammers. They didn't just sell tea. They sold poison. They took used tea leaves. They dried them out. They dyed them with sheep manure. They added copper compounds to make them green. People were slowly poisoning themselves to get their fix. The British government had lost control. They had to lower the tax. But they needed to make that money back somewhere else. And that, somewhere else, was America. What happened next shocked even the experts. A tax dispute over breakfast leaves sparked a revolution. But while America was fighting for freedom, Britain was planning something far worse in the East. They were about to become the world's biggest drug dealers. We all know about the Boston Tea Party, 1773. Americans threw tea into the harbor. No taxation without representation. It's a good story. But let's look at the other side of the world. The British East India Company was in trouble. They had a monopoly on trade with China. But China still only wanted silver. Britain's silver reserves were empty. They faced national bankruptcy. They needed a product they could sell to China. Something addictive. Something that would guarantee repeat customers. They found it in India. It was the poppy flower. Opium. The British East India Company began growing opium in Bengal. They processed it. They packed it. Then, they shipped it to China. Technically, it was illegal. The Chinese emperor had banned opium. So, the British used smugglers. They sold the opium to smugglers at sea. The smugglers brought it inland. The British got silver. They used the silver to buy tea. They shipped the tea to London. It was a perfect, deadly circle. The result was devastating. Millions of Chinese became addicted. Society began to crumble. The flow of silver reversed. Now, silver was leaving China to pay for drugs. The Chinese emperor was furious. In 1839, he sent a commissioner named Lin Zexu. Lin was incorruptible. He marched into Canton. He seized over 20,000 chests of British opium. He mixed it with lime and salt. He washed it into the sea. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. He asked her a simple question. How can you sell a poison to us that you ban in your own country? The British response was swift. They didn't apologize. They sent gunboats. This was the first Opium War. It was a massacre. Industrialized British ships destroyed the wooden Chinese junk fleet. China was forced to surrender. They had to open more ports to trade. They had to pay for the destroyed opium, and they had to give Britain a small island. That island was Hong Kong. But the British were still worried. War was expensive, and China still held the secrets of tea production. If China ever decided to stop selling tea, the British Empire would collapse. They needed their own tea industry. They needed to grow it in India. But they didn't have the plants, and they didn't have the knowledge. They needed a spy. Everything changed when they hired Robert Fortune. He was a botanist. He was a Scotsman. And he was about to pull off the greatest corporate heist of all time. The year is 1848. Robert Fortune enters China. This is a dangerous mission. Foreigners are not allowed inland. If he is caught, he will be executed. Fortune doesn't look Chinese. He is tall. He is Scottish. So he goes undercover. He shaves the front of his head. He sews a fake ponytail, a queue, into his hair. He wears Mandarin robes. He learns the language. He poses as a wealthy official from a distant province. Fortune travels deep into the tea mountains. He visits the factories. He sees the secret processes. He realizes the Chinese are using dyes to color the tea for export. He takes notes. But he needs more than notes. He needs the plants. He needs the seeds. And he needs the workers. You cannot just plant a seed and get tea. You need skilled labor to process it. Over 3 years, Fortune smuggles thousands of tea plants out of China. He hides them in glass cases called Wardian cases. These act like mini terrariums. He ships them to the Himalayas, to the British territory of India, specifically a region called Darjeeling. He also recruits 80 Chinese tea experts. He bribes them to leave their families and move to India. It was a massive gamble. Many of the plants died. The first attempts failed, but eventually they took root. The stolen plants thrived in the Indian soil. The British applied industrial farming methods. They cleared massive forests in Assam. They created tea plantations on a scale never seen before. Within a few decades, India was producing more tea than China. The Chinese monopoly was broken. The price of tea crashed. It was no longer a luxury item for the rich. It became the drink of the working class. The final chapter of this story brings us to today. The tea industry had one more evolution to undergo. It wasn't about war or spies. It was about convenience, and it happened completely by accident. Fast forward to 1908, New York City. A tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan is trying to save money. Usually, he sends samples in tin cans, but tin is expensive. So, he puts the tea leaves in small silk bags. He sends them to his customers. He expects them to cut the bag open and pour the tea out. But the customers misunderstand. They throw the whole bag into the hot water. They love it. It is easy. There is no mess. They write to Sullivan, "Send more of those little bags." The tea bag was born. Purists were horrified. They said the bag ruined the flavor. They were probably right. To make tea bags work, the leaves had to be chopped into tiny dust. This were called fannings. It brewed fast. It was strong, but it lacked the subtlety of loose leaf. However, Convenience is king. Today, 96% of tea brewed in the UK comes from a bag. Let's look at the modern world. Tea is everywhere, but it has mutated. In Taiwan, in the 1980s, someone dropped tapioca pearls into milk tea. Bubble tea was born. It is now a multi-billion-dollar global industry. In the US, sweet iced tea is a cultural staple of the South. In Morocco, mint tea is a symbol of hospitality. In Japan, the tea ceremony remains a sacred ritual. The plant is the same, Camellia sinensis, but the culture changes with every border you cross. So, let's answer the question we started with. How did tea conquer the world? It wasn't just about taste, it was about chemistry. It boiled water, saving millions from disease. It provided caffeine, powering the Industrial Revolution. It was about economics. It drove the world's first global trade networks. And sadly, it was about power. The desire for tea justified wars, colonization, and drug trafficking. Think about this. If you're drinking tea right now, you're drinking history. If it is Earl Grey, you're tasting the legacy of British aristocrats. If it is Darjeeling, you're tasting the fruits of Robert Fortune's heist. If it is a tea bag, you're tasting the accidental invention of a New York merchant. Tea is the second most consumed beverage on Earth. Only water beats it. It connects the monk in the mountains to the worker on the construction site. It is a simple leaf, but it carries the weight of empires. Now, I have a question for you. We've seen the dark history of tea, but there is another black liquid that changed the world: coffee. Its history involves dancing goats, papal bans, and revolutions. Should we cover the history of coffee next? Let me know in the comments below, and tell me, how do you take your tea? Sugar, milk, or strictly loose leaf?